Ok. Bonjour à tous. Je vais vous parler des réseaux de guêpes, mais je vais parler en fait en anglais. C'est un peu plus facile pour moi. So I'm going to talk about social wasps, and I'm studying social wasps since some years. And just recently I started to work with social network. So I'm going to talk about some preliminary results. And social wasps are obviously social insects. And the first slide is just to highlight that social insects are very powerful models for studying social network functioning. And at the same time, also social network analysis is a powerful tool to study social insects. And for several reasons, for example, some practical reasons. Social insects are easy to be reared, to be marketed, to be observed, to be confined in the lab. They are easy to be manipulated. You can take out from the network one individual or add one other individual. So you can have whole networks usually without boundaries, at least in small societies. You don't need, at least in small societies, complex automated techniques. And what is nice is that you can play with networks. You can vary the shape of the network or vary the size of the network, which is not always the case with vertebrates. Then there are some biological reasons. By nature, social insects are very social. They do a lot of different things, and they interact socially at a very high rate. In addition, inside the insect societies, not all individuals are all the same. You have different morphologies, different physiologies, and different behaviors. So usually you have, at least in not all species, but in many species, you have castes. And this could lead to the presence of structured societies, which are very, very interesting from the social network point of view. And then there are some theoretical reasons. These animals have been key models for many hot topics in evolutionary studies. So we know a lot about them. I'm going to talk about Polistes, paper wasps, and they represented, during the last decades, model organisms in evolutionary biology. And I guess that I can represent models also for social network analysis. For some reason, because they build small colonies, so easy to be followed. They are quite big, easy to be marketed and manipulated. And they build open nests. So contrary to many insects, social insects, they build open nests which are easy to be observed. I'm going to talk about Polistes minus, which among Polistes wasps is maybe one of the most studied. And I'm going to talk to you about the life cycle, which is quite representative of all Polistes wasps, at least temperate species. The colonies are annual. This is one another difference with many social insects we are used to, so like honeybees or menhans. And the colonies are founded by single females or several females altogether. In the case of several females, these females very soon establish a dominance hierarchy, with one individual who becomes the queen, the top rank individual, and the other who assume subordinate roles. So they forage, they defend the nests, they rear the brood. And these hierarchy are due to interaction, so to aggressive and dominance interactions. All these individuals cooperate to rear workers, and then workers and all the other individuals cooperate to rear reproductives, which are males and females that lead the colony. They mate, then the males die, and females cluster together in these clusters, which are called overwintering clusters. These clusters are done in sheltered places, and inside this cluster, wasps pass the winter. And those wasps who will survive the winter will found new colonies the following season. So this is the life cycle. And throughout this life cycle, there are several periods, several contexts in which we can use social network to describe the society. For example, during the establishment of hierarchy in spring, imagine that you have 4 foundresses on the nest. If you visualize with social network, it is quite easy to see that alpha is the more connected and more visible individual. Here, just 1 hour observation just to show you. And in this slide and on the other side that we present, the node size is proportional to weighted degree of the individual, and hero size is proportional to tie strength. Now, wasps do a lot of different kind of interactions, but in these preliminary results, I treated them all together because mainly there are attacks, dominance behavior, and exchange of food. And we can always identify inside each specific interaction who is the dominant individual and who is the subordinate. So here interaction goes from the dominant to the subordinate. Much more interesting is to see during this phase, in the post-emergent phase, so when also workers are on the nest, how is the society, how is the social network. Here you have workers in blue, the queen in red, and co-foundresses, subordinate foundresses in green. And once again, you see that it's quite easy to visualize who is the queen quite immediately. If we plot in-degree values and out-degree values for each of these individuals for different nests and put all together all the nests, it's quite easy to see that each phenotype has different network properties. So queens have very high levels of out-degree and low levels of in-degree, the opposite for foundresses, etc. Today, however, I don't want to talk about life in the colony, life inside the colony, but I would like to talk about social life outside the colony. Well, this is not so usual in social insects because we are used to think of social insects inside the colony. But this is the particularity of this model. And indeed, these wasps do this cluster, which are made by 50 to 100, 150 wasps. They are all mated females, so they are putative future foundresses. If they survive, they will try to found their own nest the next season. And very important, they come from different nests. So this is one another thing which is quite strange in insect societies. Usually all insect societies are done by relatives, are formed by relatives, which is not the case in this, well, it's not really a society, but it's anyway a social group. And this part of the life cycle, overwintering clusters, have been quite neglected during the last decades. Just since 8, 10 years, we discovered that it is a very key phase because it's a critical point for wasp survival, and moreover, more important, because it's a social phase. Inside this cluster, wasps do the same interaction, the same social interaction that they do on the nest. And these interactions has an importance in determining who is the queen the next season. So, just to show you, to show what these wasps do in the cluster, I have 3 videos. So we can start with the first sense. This is a video of an attack. You see this wasp attacking and biting the other. Here, the other video, you have a request for food. So you can see this wasp tapping with antennae and putting her mouth to the mouth of the other wasp. And then you can have, in the other situation, a lot of individuals asking for food and sometimes receiving food. So these are the social interactions that occurs both on the nest and in the cluster. And this interaction actually occurs at a very high rate. If you observe a cluster during the autumnal season from September to November, during the central hours of warm days when wasps are active, you can, in a cluster of 50, 60 wasps, you can see 1 interaction per minute. So they are quite active. So in this phase, with the social network approach in mind, we can ask several questions that I imagine you can always have in your mind. And to describe the social network inside the cluster, what we do is to collect the cluster in September, to mark all the wasps with colors, to transfer all the clusters inside cages, and then to observe since the end of September until the beginning of November, when wasps are no more active, all occurrences of social interaction between these wasps. And we usually do 15, 25 hours of observation per cluster. Obviously, we are interested in who does what with who. So how looks like a cluster from a social network point of view? This is the representation. Again, node size is proportional to weighted degree. And this is the direction, so these wasps did a lot of interaction, started a lot of interaction toward these other wasps. And what is immediately easy to see is that all individuals are connected. There is no clear structuration in subgroups inside the cluster. And more important, in my opinion, is that some individuals seems to be more connected than others inside this cluster. So for example, this one, this one, this one. But do you have any hint, any idea of why some individuals are more connected than others? Well, if you look at cluster, if you take a cluster and look at it, you immediately, in half an hour, realize that not all individuals are all the same. But not from a morphological point of view, but from the behavior. If you observe for half an hour, you see that a small percentage of individuals, about the 5–10%, is completely different from the other. They leave the cluster very often, they go to forage, they go back to the cluster, and they receive a lot of food requests, and they share food. On the contrary, all the other individuals almost never leave the cluster. They stay in the cluster, they wait for these individuals to go back, they ask for food a lot, and they receive food. So we can identify two behavioral phenotypes, helpers and non-helpers. So the question is, which role do helpers play inside the social network? We can thus observe one another cluster, same way as before, and we can map on this cluster who are the helpers and who are the non-helpers. And in blue, you have the helpers. So you can see the helpers here are among the most connected individuals, especially from the point of in-degree, the point of view of in-degree connections. So one other thing which is very interesting is that if you plot the network properties, the degree of helpers, with their behavior of foraging, so foraging rate, it is immediately easy to see that all helpers cluster in the right part, so it's a very clear separation. Now, this helping phenotype could be classified as altruism because it is costly for the donors, they expend energy, they have predation risks, but it's beneficial for the receiver. They have no foraging risks, no helpers staying in the cluster, and they have a trophic gain. So we could ask, which are the evolutionary explanation of this altruism? And we can think of direct fitness benefits, such as, for example, the reciprocal altruism that we were discussing yesterday with the crowns, or indirect fitness benefits, so all things that are related to relatedness. But in this case, direct fitness benefits could not exist because all helpers die in the cluster before the end of the winter, so they have no reproductive season, they have no access to the reproduction. So we can imagine, in the framework of kin selection, that help should be directed preferentially towards kin or towards former nestmates. Thus, we collect some colonies, we put them in greenhouses, we mark each wasps every week to understand later from which colony they were coming, and we then wait them for make spontaneously the cluster. We then collect the cluster and observe the cluster, and here's the result. You can see that the structure of the cluster is almost the same as before, but if you map the nest origin of each wasp on the cluster, you can see that there is no clear relationship between nest provenance, nest origin, and the interaction. So when you look at all wasps, all interactions, it seems that nest origin has not any importance. But we can look at, indeed, at the help given by helpers, so focusing on helpers and on the help they give, we can ask, do they give more help toward nestmates than toward non-nestmates? And this is not the case. So even focusing only on helping, they do not help preferentially their nestmates. And I do not have the data yet, but we are genotyping a cluster, and we are seeing that even considering relatedness, so the measure with the microsatellites of relatedness, there is no relationship. So the conclusion is that also indirect fitness benefits theory don't hold. So we can imagine that at least we didn't find any evidence for advantages, selective advantages of this helping in the cluster behavior. We can imagine, we can ask which are the real costs for helpers. And the real cost for individual depends on the fate, is the standard 2, especially in sociality. And the fate depends on the phenotype. Now, in the beginning, if you remember, I told you that all helpers are putative future foundresses. That is to say, mated individuals that, if they survive, they will build new colonies. Well, recently, it has been suggested that this is not the case, this is not true, because helpers may indeed be late workers. That is to say, workers that emerge on the nest in the last part of the season together with future foundresses, and they behave on the nest as workers, and then they shift in the cluster together with future foundresses. But this is just an hypothesis based on modeling. We need to test it, and I'm not going into details, but we tested it looking at morphology and physiology, and we found that actually helpers in the cluster are more similar to workers than to future foundresses. So from the point of view of morphology and physiology, they are like workers. But today I would like to show you that social network analysis allows us to test another prediction. If helpers are workers, if we remove the helpers from the network, we are not expecting to find other wasps to take their place, to take their behavior. And as helpers, as we saw, are very central in the network, if we remove them, we also expect to find differences in the two networks before and after removal. So we observe a cluster very shortly because we need to immediately see which are the helpers and to remove them, and we identify 4 helpers. These 4 helpers on 62 wasps were responsible for more than 70% of the foraging effort of the whole cluster. We then remove them, and this is how it looks like the cluster after the removal. First of all, we couldn't be able to find any other helpers in the cluster. From the point of view of behavior, we are not able to find any other helpers. And indeed, the 70% of foraging effort now is done by 13 wasps. So 3 times more than before. And what is interesting is, if you see here, the structure of the cluster is quite different. I mean, they're all connected. The cluster is reorganized in some way. But here you have many more individuals who are highly connected than here. So it's a more it's less odd, this cluster. And just to note, obviously there are no statistics because it's just one cluster, but just to note, the diameter passes from of the network passes from 5 to 9, and the mean path length from 180 to 39. So there are some differences, which obviously should be in many other clusters. And what is interesting is that if you look at the global behavior of the cluster, the level of food requests remain almost the same. What changes is obviously trophallaxis. You remove helpers, you no more have trophallaxis. And what is interesting is that there are many more attacks. So there is a change in the behavior of the cluster, which passes from a cluster of request and help to a cluster of request and attacks. So just to say, we could imagine the helpers are a sort of peacekeeping mechanism inside the cluster, but really, to quote that, not too much seriously. So the evolutionary consequence, the evolutionary explanation of the helping in the cluster is quite odd. We can say that we know that from the proximate point of view, helpers are workers, and non-helpers are reproductive. We also know that helpers do not help relatives, they're gonna die during the winter, so there are no, at least so far, no adaptive advantage. So we could imagine, knowing that helpers are workers, that actually helpers are helping inside the cluster not because of selected advantages that selected and lead the evolution of the helping inside the cluster, but because the benefit they have on the nest. So helping inside the cluster could be seen as a misplaced behavior or as the end part of a behavioral syndrome, and so like a byproduct of division of labor in the cluster, in the nest. So as far as workers, the production of workers is beneficial inside the nest, in the colonial context, we can also have and face some costs in the cluster. So this is a rather not common explanation, especially when studying social insects. Everything seems to be adaptive, everything seems to be well built by natural selection, but as far as, so far it seems the most parsimonious explanation. So I'd like to conclude and to highlight again that this paper seems a very good model to be studied with social network analysis. And if you see all along the life cycle, you have different kind of networks with different kind of individuals and different phenotypes, different shapes and different sizes. And I'd like to thank you all and thank all the collaborators that helped me during these years.
You showed 6 hours after removal of specific individual. Does it stay stable beyond this point, the new structure?
Yes, actually, this data refers to a cluster in a... Okay. Okay, anyway, the cluster after that 6 hour was no more a lot active. So the season was ending.
Okay.
So I can't say they just ended to behave. It was the end of the season. Okay. So in this 6 hours it was quite stable. There were no new helpers
that were
coming.
forming
It's
after.
not that we took just a little part of the, just after, and we say there are no helpers, but if you extend, we can find helpers. No, no, there are no more helpers in the cluster.
Okay.
Even if we separate these hours, there are no helpers.
Okay.
Could you have helpers among the new helpers? Well, among the 13 wasps, you had help? Oh no, they don't help us.
No. Okay, no, there are no new helpers. All the individuals rearrange the network, they increase their activity, they increase their interactions, but they do not help. They ask a lot, they ask, but nobody gives the food. That's the point. So you remove helpers, and everybody sees that something is lacking. They ask food, but there are no more helpers. So no more help, no exchange of food at all. We observe one exchange of food in 6 hours compared to, I don't know, 40, 50.
But are they capable of surviving then? Or?
Yeah. Actually, the quantity of food received in the cluster increase a little bit the survival, but not a lot. So it's really, I mean, it's beneficial, but I guess it's much more beneficial for the, because they avoid to go out to forage, which is very risky compared to staying in the tubes, but not so much for the food received. Anyway, they're well equipped with nutritional status to survive.
Okay. Later. Merci beaucoup, Alessandro.